Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Before I get into what I want to talk about today, as ever, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I've been told it helps the algorithm, so please do. Anyway, I've been reading a lot recently about Al Haymon and his venture with Premier Boxing Championships, which he started in 2015. But before I go into that and why I found it quite interesting, just a little bit about Al Heyman. For those of you who don't know him, he started his sort of entrepreneurial journey at Harvard University, where he studied economics and he went into the music business. He went into the music business and partnered with a lot of different artists and was quite successful in promoting them. And yeah, managed to represented his first fighter in the early 2000s and then managed to build relationships with um, a lot of TV executives. I think the first sort of meaningful relationship that allowed him to propel into one of the most powerful figures in boxing was with the HBO sort of executive. And then another thing that propelled him to sort of acclaim was his relationship with Floyd Mayweather, and he was sort of one of the architects that allowed Mayweather to, um, exit his top right contract for $750,000 and essentially promote himself. And in the process, he was able to become one of the very few athletes, although now that's a different story, because he's come after Al Heyman in a lawsuit with that mentions Al Heyman and Steven Espinosa, but at the time, Mayweather was full of praise for Al Heyman and sort of credited him as being the individual who was able to earn him close to $1 billion over his career. Now, a key sort of thing about Al Heyman is that he was able to leverage his connections, and I think that's something that's quite um interesting and a quite and it's something that a lot of people can take note of. Certainly myself is that you got to be in the rooms with the right people, and Al Heyman certainly was, and essentially he operated in a different sort of vein to a lot of promoters. At the time, he entered fighters into what is called an exclusive advisory agreement, which gives his company exclusive rights to their career, and in return, Al Heyman is required to use his best efforts to secure remunerative boxing matches for the boxer and counsel him in the overall development of his career. Heyman charges around 10 to 15% of a fighter's purse, which crucially is less than a standard manager's share. So he was quite well liked by a lot of boxers. I think throughout PBC's sort of reign, um, a lot of fighters were in favor of Al Heyman. They thought he was helping them, and to a lot of them he did. But where does that sort of through that he was able to sign a lot of fighters. I think he's able to sign close to 200 fighters on an advisory deal. And remember earlier I mentioned about connections and leveraging connections, and he was able to do that in 2015 where he launched his newest venture, Premier Boxing Championships, PBC, and essentially sort of flipped the model. He bought airtime across several prominent TV networks. Now, traditionally, broadcasters would pay promoters for um, airtime for them to put on events. So, Matchroom is a clear example. DAZN would pay Matchroom for X amount of fights per year. But this was sort of flipped on his head. Al Heyman sort of reached out to several prominent free to air networks and essentially paid them to put on the shows. And his idea for paying them was that he wanted to bring viewership, which in return he could sort of license to other promoters. I mean, an example of that is he spent $20 million on airtime for 20 shows at NBC and NBC Sports Network, and it essentially meant that the NBC would broadcast primetime boxing for the first time in 30 years. The first show featured Keith Thurman against Robert Guerrero and Adrian Broner against John Molina, with viewership um, peaking at 4.2 million. And PBC also agreed a 2-year deal with ESPN. 12 events aired on the network each year, 11 prime time and 1 in the afternoon. I mean, it was quite smart. He would essentially, he's essentially controlling the television networks. And I guess his thing is that, he can then sell them on. And a big part of him being able to do that was he partnered with private equity firm Waddle and Reed, and they basically gave him a war chest of 400 to 500 million dollars, to sort of spend on acquiring these primetime TV slots. I guess it was quite a smart way of um controlling the whole process of sport. And you got to bear in mind as well, in the US there's a lot of there's a thing called the Ali Act, which is quite prominent today. Essentially, promoters and managers um, have different incentives. A manager's incentive is to get the best out of their fighter, whereas a promoter is obviously trying to put on an event, so he's trying to save money. um, and the two can't be blurred. And um, as sort of time went on, it's quickly realized that this might be a conflict of interest in terms of the Aliyat. And he sort of faced a lot of litigation and um, sort of a lot of disputes by some of the leading rival promoters, most notably Golden Boy Promotions and Top Rank. Were highly litigious in um, sort of going after PBC and Al Heyman in particular. They didn't succeed in doing so, and actually, quite a lot of fighters spoke in favor of Al Heyman. They thought, that Heyman um, was doing best by them. A lot of fighters got a career high paydays, and um, they got a lot of incentives from PBC. Now, the venture of buying airtime slots didn't really work. The private equity firm behind PBC were hemorrhaging a hell of a lot of money, and it just didn't work. Um, and a lot of fighters were, I guess, one of the reasons why it didn't work was because there was no, they were staging events that essentially um, didn't uh that yeah so they were staging events that not many people wanted to see. And because not many people wanted to see, viewing figures went downhill. And they tried to really glamorize the sport. They tried to, I think I was reading a lot in preparation for this piece, and they were offered Michael Buffer an exclusive contract for $1 million in the first year and $1.1 million in the second year, to sort of stay exclusive to Al Heyman and PBC and sort of create this superior product. Long story short, that didn't work out, and I think it just went to show that. Oh, and another thing as well, like they went all out in the first show. They had Hans Zimmer going on and designing the walkout music for each fighter. They had they spent a lot of money glamorizing it, and they didn't get a lot of return for their book. And it sort of made me think, the reason why I'm saying all this is that it sort of made me think, like, does money in sport actually lead to success? And a lot of that can be translated into boxing in particular, especially now. Obviously, you've got the Saudis, TKO, Seller. These are big entities, bit with a lot of money behind them, a lot more money than the private equity firm behind PBC. Right, they had $500 million. I mean, the Saudis have an infinite amount of money, and they've gotten a lot deeper into the sport. And but does the more you spend, does it lead to success? And I don't think it does. Which, long story short, which is something that I've um sort of concluded. I mean, it didn't in PBC and um their plan to buy the television networks. And has it really succeeded in Saudi? I mean, look, they haven't had an event in Saudi for 2 3 years, and every time I've gone there, it's been good. Hospitality has been great, but in terms of like bums and seats, there were still empty seats, to be honest, on each seat, and they've spent a heck of a lot of money. Um they've gone deeper than a lot of people have. They've bought stakes in television companies. They've signed exclusive agreements with some of the major broadcast promoters. They've bought minority stakes in Matchroom, Queensbury, and they haven't had. And in terms of sort of boxing in Saudi, it's not really, well, from what I've seen and from um, you know what um what I've sort of witnessed. it, there there's still a lot of work to be done to sort of get the general Saudi population involved in the sport. But what it has done is that it's brought them influence, and um, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between PBC and Al-Haymon, and a lot of to what's going on now with the Saudis. But just with Al-Haymon, obviously he was backed by there was a limited amount of money, $400 500 million, which by the way is still a lot. But once that war chest dries down, there isn't there you can't keep going back to the well. But with the Saudis, they've gone a step deeper, and they've managed to go into the well, and um, they've bought a lot of influence. So I guess the conclusion of the video is that while it there's still going to be a hunger for, I think there's it's sort of leading me to think that there's still going to be a lot of um need for people like Queensbury and Matchroom, because they know the sport inside out, and they know how to. They might not have, granted, they've got a big budget in terms of having a broadcaster, but not as much as the others. But they know how to put on events, and they've been doing events is their bread and butter. So there'll always be a need for that. But w- while boxing give them might not give the Saudis success, it's brought them influence. Um, and they've got a lot more money than Al Heyman to throw into that, and I think that's what we're going to see. And I'll end on this. I mean, I was just watching a little bit about the unveiling of the White House card and the UFC, and that's a prime example of a lot of money and a lot of influence, and in underpinning all that is geopolitics. The Saudis are involved. You've got Turkey, you've got Dana White, you've got Donald Trump, and it's bought. I guess money buys you influence, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to success. Is a conclusion that I've sort of come to. But yeah, I just wanted to give my thoughts on that, and some of the research that I've gotten into with Al Heyman, because I think it's quite interesting, and just my current thoughts on the White House. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.